The following content has been provided by RWTH, Aachen University.
Hello everybody, welcome to the lecture. Before I get started, we're currently planning what we want to do in the project, and for this one I wanted to ask you, since if we want to do a project which involves ARKit, we need a lot of devices, and since we cannot give a lot of devices out, I wanted to ask you what kind of devices do you have. So maybe raise your hands if you have like something, an iPhone 7, 8 and everything above that. So to get a feeling, okay, a couple of them, okay, that's good. So then we can think about a project which involves these devices. If we give out these things without having the devices, it's probably quite difficult for you to implement. But there are a lot of people who have that. That's actually pretty good. Okay, Philipp introduced yesterday table view controllers and how to work with them, and he did a very long demo about this. And I want to follow up with this a little bit about how to save data. So currently, Philipp had created his own emoji list in there, and it is always generated every time the application is started again. So currently, the table view doesn't have any stored data or any information that can be stored on the hard drive of the phone. So okay, other way around. Let's do this. We want to talk a little bit about save data, and later on we'll go into other details as well. So yeah, saving data. There are multiple ways on iOS how you can save data persistent on your device or in the cloud and everything. And I will talk a little mostly about today about using encoders and decoders. So how can you actually write data into a specific file, like a JSON file or a kind of list file or binary stuff. And for these things, you're using basically encoders and decoders. So they're classes that provide certain functionality that allow you to decode and encode information into XML, JSON, and everything else. Then you have using core data, where we have a seminar topic about this. So this is a more powerful way how to store data. However, the setup is quite larger, and it has to be predefined objects. So the group who has this topic will talk about this. And yeah, you can obviously always save data into a database. SQL support is there somewhere, or you can use iCloud and other things. However, we will talk about this again. So the most easiest way is saving data into a file. Yeah, basically what you can do, you can store your data in any kind of file. So you can create a binary container and store it somewhere inside the sandbox of your application. However, if you want to use some kind of readable or structured file, the common way on iOS is to use called propertyList files. So propertyList files are basically XML files which are readable in a way that you have like kind of these structures here. And yeah, this is a typical XML format. And the good thing about this, you can create these things in Xcode, and Xcode can actually display them and read them in a very easy way. I will show a demo of this because every application already has a plist file with some information there, and can show you how it works. And the nice thing about this is that iOS provides an encoder and decoder for this particular file format already in there. So you don't have to write your own parser. You can just use the iOS parser if you follow a certain protocol that does the encoding and the decoding for you. So we'll talk about this propertyList encoder most of the time today. So what kind of data can you store in these containers or decoders? Basically, you can store everything that follows the decodable protocol. A protocol is basically consists of two functions, the init from and the decode to function, and it is basically functions where we talk about this, where you define how data storage should be stored. The good thing about this codable protocol that is mostly already implemented by most of the standard classes and structs. So you don't have to implement it for a string again, for integer, for double. So most of the structures that you create, which consist of normal data types like strings, boolean, integer, you just have to add the codable protocol to your own struct, and you don't have to write the decoder and encoder to make it work. So it's very simple in a way. Yeah, so strings, ints, double already for this, but also other data structures like NSDate, NSData, which is a binary container, can store just binaries in there, or NSURL, and a lot of other UIKit classes already fulfill this codable protocol, so you can work with this. Also, arrays, dictionaries, and other containers or collections also fulfill the codable protocol if they contain objects that are codable. So if you have your own structure in there which is not codable, obviously an array cannot store this information. So how does it work? Give you a little example here. We have a structure, a node that has two strings and an NSDate. So NSDate is a specific format. It's a class where it allows you to store the current date or any kind of date, and you can query it for a lot of information, so how it should be displayed, and so you can work with it. So it's a more complex data type, but essentially it's that. So how can we make this struct codable? Basically by adding just the codable protocol here, and then it's immediately codable because every type that is included in this is already codable. So let's initialize the new node with this entry here, and give it a timestamp, and the date timestamp is basically, here's the initializer of date. It's basically taking the current date when it's initialized. So it's the current date, seconds, and you can query this from it. So how do we encode this? First of all, we need a propertyList encoder. That's just a class. You just initialize that, and then you encode the node by saying, okay, propertyList encode new node, and then let's print it out. However, you see this little keyword that we have to add here, this try thing. And that means basically that this call that I do can fail, because failing mechanisms can have an error, because it could be that you try to encode something else which is not codable or doesn't fulfill the codable protocol. For example, if I just remove the codable protocol delegation from the node, the compiler will throw an error here, which basically, okay, it doesn't follow codable, so it cannot work. However, there could be other cases where this goes wrong, and therefore we have to handle this error, because it could be that the structure is not really clear for the compiler. It has to be on runtime, this slide, and therefore you have to use the try, so error handling methods in Swift. So error handling in Swift is not very different from other error handlings. Like in Java, we have the standard way is this do, try, catch environment, where you basically create an environment where you then execute the functions that could fail or throw an error, and then you can catch different kinds of errors if you define them in a way. Or you can use this little try, the question mark at the beginning, where we'll talk about later on if you don't care about what kind of error, you just want to handle these in a smaller way. So what kind of functions can actually throw errors, or what kind of functions can actually fail in a way? They are usually indicated by this at the end of the function, this throws keyword. That means that you always have to create a try-catch environment around these functions when you call them, because the compiler will say, okay, this function can throw an error. You have to deal with that. You cannot just ignore that. Otherwise, probably if it fails, your application will crash. So you will have to handle the errors. And what you then can do is, if you do the try-catch environment, you can define different kinds of errors. And these are usually done by an enum, where you define these different error types and define this, okay, I have error 1, 2, 3, can be an enum, or you can define this more, saying, okay, cannot read data, cannot do this. And then you can react to these errors, as if I will show you in the next slide. So how does this throw catch work? Or how does the function work? We have this function can throw an error, and it throws a string. And basically, then you basically call the different error types that you can create. In this case, you can say, I try to unwrap a certain optional. If this fails, I throw error number 1. And then the user can react to this particular error number 1. And the same thing with error number 2 and error number 3. So with this, you can create your own functions that can actually throw different kinds of errors and provide your API some kind of functionality to react to these errors. So it could be that you try to download something from the internet, but your Wi-Fi connection is not fast enough. You can calculate that. Or you cannot access the hard drive for any reason, or you try to load an image which doesn't exist. And you can then decide, okay, there is currently no network connection, and you can throw an error, and then the application can react to different kinds of, for example, tell the user, okay, enable Wi-Fi or wait until you're back in Wi-Fi. And then you can basically help the developer who uses your API or your own API. How can these errors or you can throw an information to the user. So how does then the try-catch environment work? Yeah, it's quite easy, because you can then basically do these try-catch environments. You create a do scope, and in this do scope you create the try. So you call your expression here, and then you basically catch all these different parameters. As this example, so you do try, can throw errors, and then you basically work through the errors in this case in a very simple way, and then you can react to that and maybe try it again or fix these things or give the user specific feedback saying, okay, what he has to do to wait to observe this error. So this is the common thing that you probably know from Java. However, there's a much faster way if you don't have these different error types, or if you don't care about these different error types. If you just say, okay, I want to just try a function. If it doesn't work, yeah, it doesn't work. I react with one answer. For example, if you load an image which is just not there, yeah, you cannot provide a lot of information for the user. You can say, okay, the image is not there for any reason, I don't know. And for this one, you can basically use this try with a question mark at the end, basically saying, I'm ignoring the whole do, try, catch environment. I would just want to try it. And if it fails, I will just have one detail about this. So basically, you can encapsulate that in an if statement. So we want to see fetch this server from the disk, and then you do the try. And if this succeeds, you go into the if statement. If not, then you just run over it. So you're basically ignoring. You try catch the throwing function, but you're basically ignoring what could happen, and you just return to these things. And you can also do that with multiple things. So this is something that you always see when you load an image from your bundle. You have to try catch, because it could be that it's not there, but yeah, you don't do real large try catch environment for these cases. What you can also do is you can also force try something. Like again, Swift allows you to say, tells you, okay, you should do the question mark, but you can also say, yeah, I'm really sure that the data is there, or that the image is in my bundle, and then I'm forced trying that, and you can do that with the exclamation mark at the end, similar to the other concept that we see. However, again, if this image is not there for any reason, your application just crashes. However, you see that a lot when people are actually loading an image into the bundle and they say, okay, I don't care about the return because it would never be called. I'm really, really certain that this will be followed, so you can do this, the force try, and then you can get through these compiler errors that says, okay, you have to do the try environment. So this is working around these issues. So how do we encode the data? Yeah, basically, it's similar. Encoding the data is then as we have here, we have the try-catch environment. And the decode environment is essentially the same thing, just the other way around. You basically need another propertyList decoder, not encoder in this case, and then you decode the message basically saying, I want to have decode my information in this particular format. It should be node self, basically gives a reference to that structure. So the data should be encoded into this value, and then the encoder basically creates a struct out of the data construction. However, this can also fail because you could have encoded something else. So this is a much more, in this particular case, this happens much more often that it fails because you encode something or decode something which is actually not there anymore. And then you take the data type, and then you're basically done. Okay, now we have our data in kind of a binary container, which allows us to store the information on the device or anywhere else, or send it through a network, something like this. However, how can we actually then store it actually on the device? And as I already said, iOS applications are very, very, very strictly sandboxed. So there is no root folder which you can access. You're not allowed to create any folder anywhere, but you have some kind of rights, and actually every application gives you some kind of storage environment inside the application. And this is called the document directory. So it's a specific part in your application where you can access, where you're allowed to create folders and structures. However, it's very limited in the scope, and only your application is capable of accessing that. You can flag some files that are now visible in the Files app as well. However, this you have to manually decide on that. But however, the typical thing is you just put it in there. If you have, for example, if you have a config file you want to store it, you usually put that in there in some kind of XML format. How to access this? So there's a class and it's file manager or file manager, and this file manager basically handles file types and it can access specific URLs. And URLs are not just websites. URLs are basically passes on your device, but also URLs. So there's this class URLs, which is similar to a string. However, it has a lot of convenience functions saying, okay, I want to have the last part of that thing. And it works basically, checks the structure of the string, so you have like a more pass-like structure. And we will see that also when we work with webs, you can actually also access websites with these things. So what you do is, okay, I want to have the default file manager because it's a single class usually, but you can create more if you want to. And then you access this document directory, and I also want to have a user domain mask, and it usually returns multiple of these things. So it's returning an array, and I'm just taking the first one. And here you see I use the exclamation mark because I know this always exists. But the first one is basically an optional. It could be that an array returns usually saying, oh yeah, does not contain any object. However, in this case, this always exists. And this is the path, the document directory. So I'm currently in the root level of my application where I can store data. And then I can just, oh, sorry, wrong button, create a file by basically saying, okay, document directory, appending path component. I create this list, appending path existence. So basically creating a URL for my file. So this is basically saying, okay, this is my document directory, and I created this node_test.plist file. And you can see here you already have these convenience functions from the URL that you can separate the different parts of URL and different components like file types. Last part of the name, but you can also query through the entire list of your URL in a very similar way. And to write this data is you basically just have to enable this. So here's our file manager, here's our URL, and then basically then we tell the encoder node, which is this class here, write to archive with option no file protection. So basically this encoder node now tries to write this to this particular file. Again, you have to do a try environment because it could fail for any potential reason. And then you basically, okay, I want to write this documentation into the file. As you can see, you have multiple options. So you can use encryption, for example. There are multiple ways how you can encrypt your data if you want to. However, for this case, we don't do that. But if you have some sensitive data in your application, maybe some kind of models or data structure that you really, really want to protect, and that even people who hack a phone should not be able to access, then you should use some kind of file protection. Because there are some rootkit enablers for iOS which allow you to access this. So theoretically it could be hacked, but here you can use this. Yes?
By assigning the path to archive URL, is the file already created?
No, it is just in the link. It's basically just defining, okay, I want to have this in this particular type. So it's not existing. It's
and by writing
it creates this one. It checks if it exists. And then it overrides it usually in a typical way. But you can, this one does not do anything. It's just a string. It just creates like an URL string and doesn't exist anywhere. So basically the only thing when something happens here is at this point. And you can see that because here this is not a try-catch environment. So it's basically, yeah. You can also create a new folder. For example, you could create an additional folder, so it will also create the subfolders in between. So you can create a URL to different levels. Yes?
What happens if you
it will override it. It will just override it in the table comments. You can catch that. For example, you can ask, you could, if you want to catch that, you can ask if this file already exists. So you can ask the file manager, does this file exist? If yes, you can open it again, load it again, and update it if you want to. But typically, this thing writes just into this URL, and it doesn't really matter if there's something or not. Yeah. OK. Now we have data on our hard drive, how we can get it back. And this is basically also quite simple by saying, OK, I have my propertyList decoder because I saved it as a propertyList. And what I'm doing is I'm taking the data class, and then it should read the content of my URL. So, and the data class is basically a binary container with some additional functionality, but it is quite, yeah, container of data storage, which can read and write from files. And then you basically say, OK, I want to decode from this retrieved notar data, and then I'm basically done. So this is the basic concept. To show you how it works, I will extend Philipp's app from yesterday using this simple functionalities. No, wait. Switch to, no, not this one. So this is the application from yesterday, so the emoji table. Now I'm just starting this. See if it still works. Yeah, it still works fine. So we have our table view here. However, Philipp just created this data every time the application is started in this thing. And I will just remove this and basically say, OK, emoji editor should be empty. So, and if I start this again, so nothing happens here, and I will just add these data structures. Oh, let me get this one out here. So the first thing is we have to fulfill the, so what we want to save here is the emoji struct. And the struct consists just of 4 strings, so it's quite easy to make it codable by just adding this one, and now this file is, or this struct is codable. So now's the question, when do we want to save the data? So what we could do, we could save the data every time we add something. However, this would require some more writing, and every time you add something, you would do that. One way to do it is you can actually go back to the scene delegate and say, OK, every time the application is closed, save my data. Or it goes in the background. And you can do that basically going to the scene delegate, and I will add this to scene will resign active. So basically, every time the application is disabled or goes into the background, this function is called. And at this point, I would just want to save my data. One hint, when you develop applications and you run your application and then you press this button, so the stop button, most of these functions are not triggered in this case. So this is a typical pitfall for developers, because this basically just kills the process, and all the closing applications are not function there. So every time you want to use these functions, make sure that they're actually triggered. And if you stop your applications just using the stop button, a lot of these functions are not called. So this is a typical error when you have something, do something on going inactive. But usually when you stop this, the application is killed, and you will never enter the inactive state. So what we want to do now is we want to, first of all, what we need the access to the table view controller. And for this one, I have to go through the structure of the application to get it. So as I know my application, or Philipp's application, that we have a navigation controller. So what I need to do first is get the navigation controller. And I can ask the window here. And I get the root view controller. And since I know this is a UI navigation controller, I can just force cast it into this thing to avoid some error handling. And then I can get my emoji table in the same way, and asking, doing navigation, navi controller, view controller, the first one. because I know the structure of the application, and it should be casted as an emoji. Table view controller. So, and with this, I have access to the file and can actually read the data structure or this emoji thing that I want to decode later on. So, the next thing I need to do is to get the URL. Let me do that now. Document directory. Oh, sorry. Document directory, file manager. Ah. The default manager and URLs, and then I take the document directory, and I'm taking the user domain and the first one of this one. See if it works. Yeah, it's not used, so that's so. And then I'm creating the URL. Document directory, append, let's call it test, and append path extension, and I'm going to use it as the plist. And then I'm basically encoding this array. Say I need a call it encoder, list encoder. Take the property list encoder, not decoder. Create this object and take the encoding emojis, and then I'd use the try because I ignore the errors, and take the list encoder and encode emoji table, and here I take the emoji array. So I'm using the entire array, which is currently empty, and encode this. So, and the next thing is I just have to just write this to the file, as I showed you beforehand, to the URL. Right. I want to take the option, this one, URL, and no, file protection. So now I have written data every time I close the application or I disable the application. This one is called, and it basically dumps all the content of that array into my storage. So this is now saving. However, we also have to load this information, and the question is now, where do we load this information? For this one, I copy some stuff here because I don't want to rewrite it again. So where's a good place to load information? It's yes.
You have to see what's active.
Yeah. Do you know where it is? Yes.
In the view did load, because we don't have to load it once when the application is started, because if it's killed, it will be started again, and otherwise it won't.
Yeah, exactly. You can go just to the view did load here. So we are now in the table view. So every time this view did load, I want to update it. It could be also that I have an application where I have a different view who adds information. So it is always a good case to load this if you don't need it anywhere else. If you need it anywhere else and you have multiple views, then you probably have to load it in your starting application, so in the app delegate or in the scene manager. But if you really just need the data inside one particular view controller, you just load it at this point in time. So maybe it's a good start here. So again, document directory, I have it here, and then I load my list decoder, propertyList decoder, and I I first of all try to retrieve the data. Wait. Retrieve no data should be try. Then I take the data file and then content of URL, and if this is also successful, I decode this information, decoded emojis. I directly decode this, and I'm using the try again and say property list. I called it list decoder decode, and here I'm telling the system, okay, it's not like one particular element, but it's actually an array. Oh, should be like this, and just defined here. And from our retrieve node data, and then I basically assign this. Should be making this into the if statement, otherwise it will fail. Yeah. Decoded emojis. So that's basically it. Let's run this. So currently it's empty. I'm creating some kind of symbol, just putting in some random data. I'm saving this now. And now it's basically here. And I'm basically, if I can show you that I'm just putting a breakpoint in here to show you that it actually works at this point in time. So when I now slide, I'm running into the decoder. So this is called exactly at that point in time. So my application is killed, is basically in the background. Sorry. And if I start this again, no, this is the wrong application. Sorry. Should start the right application. Where is it? Where did Philipp put it? Ah, there it is. Yeah, okay, it's done there. So, and this works in the same way, and I can remove this again. And now I can actually also kill the application because it was saved in this particular time, and I can load it again, so you have to load it in a way. All right, so this is basically the simple way of saving and loading. Going back to slides. So this is just propertyList encoder, and there are multiple other encoders, and one of the other most common one is the JSON encoder, and it exactly works the same way. So you can use the same approach. JSON is also an XML format, and you can use the same approach to do that. And you have, instead of like plist encoders, you have just JSON decoders and encoders, but it works essentially the same way. Here you have this structure of employer's name, which has a name, an ID, and a favorite car, and this car has just a string, and you have these information and do the encode and decoding. You can also say, and it will be that you have, it takes the variable names as definitions. Yes?
Does it work if we change the type by aliasing the name of the type? Instead of ID integer, we would rename the integer type to ID and I'm not sure. Probably the encoder would get rid of the aliases because it takes the data structure. But we will continue on that. How do you actually name your JSON files on the next slide? So currently what it does, it creates this JSON file and takes basically the name of each value depending on the variable name. So we have this, then you have name, ID, and favorite car in here, and it will take this thing. However, you can actually decide if you want to have in your JSON file, you want to have different keys for your values. So you can change the keys that it looks differently or maybe fulfills a certain API and makes sense to have your data structure in your code should be different from your JSON file. And this can be done by adding these coding keys in orations, and which fulfills the string protocol and the coding keyword. And here you can basically tell, okay, the variable ID should be actually saved as employer ID to make it more readable depending on your different levels. So here you can actually tell the applications that it works out. However, particularly this structure creates some kind of weird JSON file, and it will create something like this.
It will have employer ID, 7, name is John Appleseed, and then since the structure contains another structure, it creates another subpart in your XML file, and then you have your favorite car, and then you have the properties of this one. This is maybe not the best way to do that in JSON, and it creates, like, if you think about, you have multiple structures inside multiple structures, the JSON will get very deep in its level, so maybe you want to get rid of this. And for this one, you have to do the encoder and decoder yourself. So maybe a more easier way would be something like this for this data structure. So get rid of the subclass in here, and you just want to have, okay, these informations in there. However, in this case, now you have to write your encoder and decoder yourself, because now it does not follow the structure of the structs. It should start on further. And this can be done by implementing the encoder and decoder functions that are usually when you have encodable options which are integrated. And here you basically define these containers and basically encode this yourself. And here you take the encoder and take the encoding keys that we just defined, and then you basically tell every part of your variables how they should be encoded. So basically, the container name should be encoded for the key name, which is defined in the coding keyword, and this one is also for the ID, which checks in the coding keys. And then what we do in the last one is basically encode, say, okay, favorite name car should be not encoded as its own structure, but it should be encoded as your favorite car ID in this case. So what it basically does, it takes the structure away and then it decodes in the same way. The decoder is exactly the same, just the other way around. And you basically initialize basically from this one. Usually put that into initializer and decode from the coding keywords. The first ones are exactly the same as the default encoder would look like. However, in this last thing, you say, okay, I want to decode for my favorite card thing. I want to initialize this string here, and then I say, okay, favorite card should have the favorite card initialized. So if you have a deeper structure of multiple classes or structs included in that, you have to initialize them all in your own thing. So this is the simplest way. If we go back to core data, you will see there you don't have to deal with all of this. Core data does that automatically. However, I don't want to spoil the seminar on this topic, but we'll continue. So for the second part of the lecture, I want to talk a little bit about system view controllers. Go a little bit into iOS. Does anybody have an idea what a system view controller could be? No idea. Okay, system view controllers are basically predefined control sets that you can just put into your application. And the most common example is probably the camera. So, or the browser. You probably have seen that when you are in your application and you click on a link. It does not directly go to a different browser, but it opens a browser in the application itself. So you have some kind of predefined setups that you can use, and the camera as well. So for example, on WhatsApp or whatever, you click, no, WhatsApp I have actually a custom one, but other applications just say, I don't want to implement the whole camera stack on my own. I'm just want to use specific, the camera stack in there. I want to use this one just for photos. And there are lots of different view controllers. For example, you can have like an alert. You can do the sharing is also a common one that you see. If you, for example, you select an image in your application, you want to share it to someone, you can have this sharing view controller. Via Safari, alert, image view picker, so it allows you to pick something from your data source or from your camera. And also, you have some mail compositor views, so basically can create a mail, so you can create the header, the target address, and all of these things already in your. So you can have some specific controllers that you can just hook into your application, which are provided by Apple. So for this one, I will also show you a demo. Oh, there's one object so much. And I will go through these things and how they can be implemented. To set up this, I created a small application and which has this image, and it has 4 buttons called Share, Safari, Camera, and Email. And from this on, I will show you the different kinds of controllers that you can load. The first one is the activity controller, so it's the sharing. So you select the image, you want to share it to Twitter or whatever. The second one is the Safari browser, so you can not go to the Safari app, but you can open a browser in your own application and target to a specific URL. And the other controller so basically have these little pop-ups here where you can have some multiple options, which are commonly used for camera or images. Then the picker view, so go to your image view, and you basically can select an image that is in your image storage and the camera. And the last thing is the mail compositor, where you can create for example, you could have like, you want to send an email to support if something's wrong with the application, you can predefine some information with the subject, with the target, and some initialized text, and you can basically target that from this one. Okay, for this one we switch back to the demo, and let's see if I can make it work. So what this one I will develop actually directly on my phone because I want to show you the view, the camera view. Let's get rid of this one here. So this is the image in here, and the view controller is very simple. It has just these 4 buttons, and it has these images. And I predefined these target buttons, so the share button triggers this action, and I will follow that live. So, and important thing is I have these, this image view is also initialized here. So it's basically an IB outlet, and I'm following several protocols. The image picker controller, the navigation controller, and the mail compositor. So basically, these functions allow me to get some back information. So for example, if I select an image from my picker view, I need to handle this, and I have to fulfill a certain protocol, so I actually can set these values or fulfill certain values. So let's get started with the share button. So what I want to do, I want to share this image to someone or anything else. So the first thing, since I want to use the image, I'm using guard statement if the image is actually there. So basically make sure that the image is there. So I'm taking the activity controller, and I'm creating a new activity. Where is it? Activity view controller. And I want to append a certain object, so I want to use the objects that should be sended, and this is basically an array because you can send multiple objects. However, in my case, I'm just using the object containing of one of the image, and I'm using this one as null. Doesn't need that now. And this allows me then to use this activity controller to create this a popover presentation controller. Now the names get really, really long. And it should be rooted in my source view sender. So that's the button basically. It should be implemented in this thing. And then I'm basically saying no, sorry, wrong notification. So present activity controller, and should be animated. Sure, why not? And then I can handle something if something goes. I can react to a certain level when I'm done. So now the magic moment, if it works. Come on. Compile. You're right. See, test it out. Yeah, it works. So I have a recording here of my screen. So this is currently my view So I'm recording currently my device, and I can click now the share information. Now I can share this to, for example, to my MacBook or some of my friends here. I can send a message to anybody. I can create a mail. And then objectively, the container that I basically put in here are sent as a data container as well. So they have to be codable, obviously, because otherwise they will not be able to transfer. But in this case, I can just use the share information to share to any application that is capable of accepting that particular data type. So basically, and you can in your system, you can actually decide on these things. Okay, specific applications can take text, specific applications can images, and usually this list is filled out. Either you define it on your device itself, or it looks for application that fulfill the service. Okay, I can accept images. Okay, let's move on. So what we want to do next is we want to have like open a Safari view, and for this one here, I'm taking just creating a URL, basically saying, okay, I want to open a website, and I'm just taking let's do just the Apple website. And for this one, if this is true, I'm creating this Safari controller and SF. Safari controller should be loaded with the URL, which I defined here, and again, then present the view controller. Let's do that true, and I don't want to have any kind of handle that reacts when I'm done with that. So basically, here you can add a closure, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. Closures are basically lambda constructions, when you know that, or blocks on Objective-C. So some kind of code that you move to a certain thing, and then it will execute if it's triggered there. But we will talk about this next week. And let's render this again and see what happens. So if I click now the Safari application, you will see it will jump directly. And as you can see, it does not switch to the Safari application, but it actually goes to the website itself. And you can go back to done, and it closes this up. So let's do the email one, and then we will. The last one will be the camera because it's a little bit longer. So email is also very similar to this thing, and first I have to check if actually this name is very long. Write this down, and I will explain what it is. Can't send email. So what it does, usually it checks this MF email composer view controller is a class that allows you to check if the current state of your application or the system actually is capable of sending an email. So if an email account is set up, if you don't have set up any email address, this will fail. But also, for example, the simulator will fail because there is no email set up initialized with this thing. So this is just precaution that say, okay, to check if it's actually possible. Cannot send mail. So when this is out of the way, let's use the mail composer. So basically what we do, we design a specific email that should be sent when we use the controller. So create this object, and now we use the set a delegate, which we'll use later on, and therefore we implemented we fulfilled this protocol here that we actually can send information. Now we can basically compose our email. So we can set to recipient, And here we can add certain email addresses. Let me send that to me. And in the same way, we can set a subject. Should be hi or something like this. And then we can basically design our own body of the document, of the email. Let's do it like this. And what you can also do is you can design a whole email with some kind of style images and using HTML if you want to. So you can create it like a fully function. You can add logos and everything in there because it takes basically HTML content, and then it can actually use this one. So, and then again, we use the present view controller. Mail compositor should be true, and I want to react with nil. So, however, now we have, if we start this, let's see what happens. Yeah, I have to unlock my phone. Switch to the one, and then I've clicked now mail, and then I can send me an email with this content. However, now nothing happens because the system doesn't know what it should do when it's done. Because now we have to say, okay, what happens if people are actually sending the email? So this day, nothing happens. I probably did send me a couple of emails. However, I'm stuck in this thing because it doesn't have the completion handler in this case. So what you now have to do is you have to react to when the application is basically done. And for this one, you have to implement one of these functions in here of the mail composer view delegate, and we'll just use this here. And it's called mail composer, and it already does auto-completion here in this case. Let me think if I have the right one. Yes. And what I do now is basically just call the dismiss thing. So basically, when I'm done with the application, I want to dismiss this view that I just put on top of my application, and I can just use the dismiss in case, and it then dismisses its call. Unlocking my phone again. And I can get the email, and now I'm back to this because now the function is called back and the application does know what it could also, this is usually used if you, for example, create a support email that then it gives you some information. Okay, thank you, you are received your email, so you can go to a different view in this particular use case. That's why it's implemented. Okay, now going to the camera button. So what we want to do now is basically replace the image that is in our application, and we want to replace this one with anything that we created, a photo, or we created something from our storage. And for this one, we have to first create like a little popover view at the bottom that tells us, okay, you want to use the image picker, which are images already on my device, or do you want to have the camera? And for this one, we have to create an alert controller, which is basically creating these little pop-ups, and we want to give them a certain functionality. So first thing is I'm creating the image picker, which is a UI image picker controller, and this controller has needs to have a delegate, and which is in this case our class here. And now we create the alert controller. And this is a UI alert controller, and it has a title. It should be choose image, and don't want to have a message there in addition, but you could define these things. And it should be have some kind of style where you have multiple styles, and then taking the typical one, which is the action style. If you want to know what kind of other styles are there, you can add them as well. And now what I do now is I create multiple buttons. I create the cancel button. So to get rid of it, otherwise we are stuck again in this point. And this is a UI action. Alert action. Alert action, and it is where's my auto completion? Yeah, title should be cancel. It should be have the style. There's this specific, and then it has this handler. So every time it is clicked, and this handler is basically nil because it just gets rid of this. And then create another one. Let's do the camera action. So this is the one that opens up the camera view. And call it camera. Should have the default view. So the cancel view is like the button looks red and is at the bottom. And now we create this handler. And this handler is a small preview into how a block should look like. What I do now is induce a certain part of code that it will be executed as soon as I click this one. And this is basically put into this bracket to make it a little bit more easier to see. So what happens here is action in is the definition, and then I have the image picker source type. Should be my camera. So I'm basically saying I want to have this camera information, and then I'm presenting basically the image picker where does it present and the auto completion did fail me. Yeah, should be animated, and completion, no. Yeah, there it is. Should be nil, and then I'm basically done with these. Oh, this should be true, not this one. So this looks a little bit weird. Oh, I broke something. Let's see, what did I break? This one is too much, I guess. Yeah. So what I created here is basically, okay, I'm creating this button, this UI alert action, and when it should be clicked, it should execute this structure. So this means that an action should be triggered in is the keyword for closure block up, and then I have my source type basically saying I want to use the camera, and then create the image picker that I defined here, and it should be animated and basically pops up the image. However, currently, as you can see, these are just initialized, not used, so we have to add them later on to the view. So for the last one, it is very similar to the one I just created. However, in this case, we slightly modify this, and basically we can just copy this one and rephrase it a little bit and saying this should be photo action, and it takes the photo from my photo library, and I'm basically changing just this one here, photo library, and it's basically uses the same environment. So now I created my alert controller here, and now I have to attach these different elements to the alert controller. So, and I can do that by just add action, cancel, action, alert, controller, add action, camera action, and alert, controller, add action, the photo action. And then I again define, okay, the alert controller should be displayed in my view. This popover presenter pickup controller, very long name. The source view should be again the sender, so it actually should be inside the view where I just triggered this information. And then I'm doing the present There's the auto completion. Alert controller should be animated, and I don't want to do anything when I'm done. Okay. This should be it? Not entirely. Because what we will do now is when I execute this one, this already does something. Let's see. So if I go to this one and I'm clicking on the camera, you see, okay, I have this choose image. This is defined by. However, it crashed. The application just died, as you can see here. And this is due to what we want to do now is we want to access external resources. We want to access the camera, and we want to access the photo library. And for this one, we have to have permissions in the application. And these permissions have to be set by the user, and we have to ask the user for these particular permissions. Because we want to have the camera information, and you see usually when the first time is this, okay, what do you want to use the camera, and you can have string there, and then the user has to agree on this one. And this is can be defined in this info plist. Basically, the info plist is similar to the format I showed. It is the same format, and it contains certain information about the application. It has the versioning, it has some localized information, and here you basically define these different levels. So it's pretty hard to see here, but however, currently it doesn't really help you a lot. So you have some bundle information where you can set, okay, this is version number 5 of my application, and you have a lot of different strings out there that can be used. So what I will do now is basically add a different string category, and this is called privacy, and these are basically the types that you have to add if you want to access certain resources, for example, camera, Bluetooth, all of these informations where the user has to agree in the application, okay, they want to use them. There are different levels later on when we use core application or core graphics or other things where where you have to be part of a specific program to use it. For example, iCloud cannot be used by any developer. You have to pay for it actually. This is another setup, but using the resources of the application, of the device, you usually set that up in here. Yes?
You can also do it in the project management, so it's a blue icon in the...
Yeah, you can also do that there.
Yeah.
But I will just use it here because here we define basically the string itself.
There's a string that is showed with a message what you're typing in, so I use this...
Exactly, and that's what I'm basically doing here. So basically, I'm using the camera usage description. So basically, this is the string that the user will see when the first time this camera is used, and this is the permission. So, for example, I want to share photos from the camera. And this is a camera usage description, but we need another one. This is, again, privacy. And this is the, which is, the string is too long. Privacy, it's called the photo library. I use the same string from photos. So these are the strings that you have to define, and that allow you then to use these different levels. So going back to this one, and I'm taking the camera, and now I have the camera, and you can see here, okay, this is the question that I just typed in to share the photos, and then I can use this to get an image of this, and if I want to cancel that, I can use the camera and take one of the photo libraries, and then it does the same thing. So, however, if I now take a photo, it takes a photo, and I use the photo, what should happen afterwards. And for this one, we have to implement again, like a handle, the delegate function. It's the last part for today. And this is actually quite simple. Basically, it's a function called image picker controller. So basically, it gets the selected information, and then you can deal with the information in the same way. So first, first I will ask if the info that I just received here of the UI image, where is it? UI image picker controller. Oh, wait. Too long names. Original image, it's the one I usually as UI image. Where did I mistype? Is it? No, it should be one term. Maybe let's see what I have here. I have my cheat code here. There it is. Yes, it is different now. Two long strings. So these are some legacy information that you have from Objective-C, and you immediately see why maybe Objective-C was a very long written language, because you have to do a lot of information here. Oh, info. What? I have this control function. Why does it break? Interesting. Okay, let's take the full function in here, because this one is the one that worked. Take just the one that I had. Okay, Xcode doesn't like me today. So what you can do is, in this case, you unpack this information and basically say, okay, I want to have the unpack if the content that I just received, is it an image? And then you can basically say, okay, image to my IB outlet can set the image to that particular one. And then you can dismiss the information again. So you basically take the information that you get, uncode it, or check if it's actually the content that you wanted to have, because the photo thing can also select multiple of them, but you just want to have just one. You have to handle multiple of them, because at the end it will probably, if you get an array of images, the last one will be set or something like this. And yeah, so then you can handle these different informations. So these are some couple of examples for the view, for the system view controllers, and there are several of them more, and there are so different styles, and you can actually edit these in a different way. With this, I want to conclude the lecture for today, and next Monday we will talk about a little bit more about closures, or give you an introduction to closures in a little more detail. And Tuesday there's no lecture because there's Dies. I think it's Sportfest or something. I'm not sure. Oh yeah, Fachschaft-Vollversammlung, the other one. Yeah, there are two. So we have just a lecture on Monday, and then the week afterwards we are starting with the last two lectures, and the first groups will have then already discussions for the seminars, but we will talk about this on next Monday. All right, and thank you for coming.
This content was provided by RWTH, Aachen University.